This is Risk Reframed, the show where we bring you the leading risk experts from Moody's, our partners, and the wider ecosystem to discuss the risks organisations face, how they're interconnected, and ultimately what you, the risk professional, can do about them. Third-party risk management is sometimes used as an umbrella term, and it can include KYC, supplier onboarding, due diligence. So how do we tease out what is TPRM and what is something else? And what does it take to have a best-in-class TPRM program? Well, to help us figure that out, we have Marisol Lopez Mellado. Thank you so much, Marisol, for making time and coming in. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
You and I go way back because I tried to come and sell to you once upon a time in one of your previous roles, but fortunately you didn't hold that against me when you joined Moody's. So I'm very grateful. Start at the start, right? I just mentioned we've got to define this thing. So how do you think about third-party risk management? How do you define it?
I mean, third-party risk management is a very broad definition, but ultimately the way I like to think about it is what is the risk associated in making business with any third parties? And within those third parties, you may have suppliers, you might have vendors, you might have distributors, or you might have even consultants or professional services consultants that offer any sort of services to you. And there is always a risk associated to making business with those third parties, and therefore is about getting to know and processing due diligence to assess, are there any risks associated by, engaging with them. It also includes, further down the line by the way of defining those third parties, what is then the potential higher risk? So if it's a supplier that is supplying a specific raw material for me to finalize a product that I need to go to market to, then there will be a higher risk associated than if it's a vendor that is supplying notebooks to my organization. Right? So it's about assessing and defining those third parties according to the services or the relationship that they have with you as an organization.
So what I'm hearing there, so there's the onboarding, due diligence and assessment of customers, what we often call KYC, at least in the financial institutions and corporations, it might be called third-party onboarding or third-party due diligence. You mentioned the supplier side, so you've got some people talk about supplier risk and other people talk about supply chain risk management. Sounds like supplier risk might be in there, that initial assessment, but would supply chain be something else because it's not about the specific third party? Is that fair?
There are three aspects of what you've said in terms of definitions. Due diligence on clients, and for financial services that are regulated, they have to comply with anti-money laundering regulations and therefore perform due diligence on those direct clients. So to simplify the concept, I like to think about any organization that is regulated, financial services organizations that are regulated and they liaise with third-party money, they are obliged to perform that customer due diligence.
Okay. That
to me is due diligence on your direct clients. Then there is within TPRM or third-party risk management, the rest. The rest is those third parties, the vendors, the suppliers, and the distributors, the others. Within third-party risk management, you were mentioning about what is the difference between supply chain risk and supply risk. And ultimately, it comes back to within supply chain, it affects the entire network of your suppliers, and it's going to have a higher effect. So this could be, for instance, if there is a natural disaster, let's say, and you are dependent on multiple suppliers to provide raw materials for you to finalize the end product, the consequences can be quite large. If you're looking at supply risk, it's the risk associated individually with that specific supplier.
Okay.
So you would be looking at, is that supplier, or what is the probability of default of that supplier? Because if tomorrow it files for bankruptcy, there could be an issue for me if they are not able to supply the specifics for ABCD that I need to, that again, perform a specific role or getting to market a specific product. So there is due diligence on customers for regulated entities on clients, which is to fulfill AML requirements. And then within third-party risk, you're looking at your supply chains or your supply risk. And within those areas, the risk that you are looking at is bribery and corruption, reputational risk, ESG risk, climate risk, cybersecurity risk, operational risk. That would be very important within your supply chains. And then it's the differentiation between the risk associated with an individual level versus the entire network.
Great points. We're going to come back to the component parts of TPRM, but it's a good primer there. Sounds like from what you're saying for the definitions is that you've got supplier risk or supplier onboarding where risk is assessed, and that feeds into TPRM. It's one of the forms of TPRM. However, that TPRM is going to feed into supply chain risk management where you're looking at the overall network and the effect and the knock-on effects and so on. And we're going to do a whole 101 episode on supply chain risk management. So nice primer for that episode as well. Thank you, Marisol.
Fantastic.
I mean, this probably seems a bit basic, but this is a back to basics episode, really. So for the uninitiated, why is TPRM so important to get right?
Because of the potential consequences that you may have in liaising with third parties that might be bad actors. At the end of the day, it's about understanding who you're making business with. And it's essential to understand if any of those third parties can put you at any particular risk of getting involved into potential crimes.
And I suppose beyond that, would there be some risks that are also not necessarily criminal, but are, they're in a certain geological area, so they could be at risk of the earthquake? I know that's more of supply chain again, but that could affect that individual supplier.
Absolutely. So it's everything involved about climate risk. And we've seen, sadly, over the last 12 months, how, there has been natural disasters which might be out of our control, but affects directly, organizations that have particular suppliers on specific areas and regions. And therefore, it's very important to understand what is the geolocation risk, right? So of making business with organizations located in a particular area, whether it's close to a river or, depending on what they really do. I mean, I recall sadly the episode last year of the floods in Spain. And at the time I was there talking to some clients and they were quite overwhelmed because they had a lot of suppliers that were located in the area. And some of those went out of business because their entire operations, warehouses were destroyed by the water. Okay. Of course, that has a high impact on, in this case, it's not a criminal action, but in this case, it has quite a large impact on the revenue of your organization, not to say, of course, with, how dramatic the situation was on a personal and individual level.
Yeah, so it still has to be managed though, right? So the TPRM team will have, hopefully has picked up that risk, has mitigated it, maybe had some plans in place, and then that would have fed into any supply chain considerations as well.
Correct.
Any inventory conversations, etc. So given it's such a broad term, and you mentioned some of the different parts of what makes TPRM up, I mean, one, is it helpful to have such a broad term? And then is there a way that organizations have sort of evolved their organizational setup to meet all of those different types of third party they've got to assess and understand? What have you seen in the market?
We are seeing more and more a concentration on what I call the proportionality, assessment on your third parties. What that means is assessing and defining your third parties based on three different things. What is the relationship that you have with them? So commercially, what is that they are providing? What is that you're engaging with? The commercial value and their location and the term, the length of the contract as well, or that contractual relationship. And then by looking and prioritizing based on that risk assessment, ultimately, you are just trying to put into buckets those third parties based on what they do for you as an organization, and then trying to prioritize, where do I concentrate my efforts in terms of performing due diligence, assessing those risk parameters, identifying if there is any risk, and ultimately to what you referred earlier, which is how do I mitigate those risks, right? So that this doesn't happen again in the future. So there is definitely a way of looking and prioritizing based on third parties. And also, I would say that the second trend which is linked to this, is looking at the unified risk.
Okay.
It's no longer looking at or performing due diligence in isolation, but looking at, what is the overall and unified risk that I have by engaging with this particular third party. And it's having information across all the multiple departments that are liaising with that third party.
Okay. So that's an interesting point. You mentioned all the departments. So is the setup typically still having specialists and specialist teams looking at the different aspects, and then it's a system that combines them to that unified risk? Or are we seeing any sort of trend where, because TPRM is so broad but so important, are we seeing more generalist teams who kind of cover everything themselves or have tools to help them with the areas that they might not have as much specialist knowledge in?
We are seeing a centralization of information and data and specialized teams. And I'll elaborate a little bit further.
Please.
On a corporation, a third-party relationship might start with procurement or with a sales representative. And there is always an initiation of due diligence at that specific point. But if they identified, let's say, a potential risk, that would be passed into, compliance or the specific, anti-bribery, anti-corruption teams working for that organization. They might need to assess what is the ESG impact, cybersecurity impact, or climate impact. And then there has to be specialized teams looking at that information to make sure that they compile the relevant data and to understand what they read is accurate, right? So all that is being unified in single platforms as we speak. And then there is a last, team looking into all the compiled information to take a decision. And then if they identified any risk, what would be the mitigation?
Yeah.
And sometimes mitigation could be, we are seeing that, right? Like up to providing some specific training to that third party, or whether you need to start looking for another third party or, supplier that is in a similar region or a different region, but, depending on what you have identified. But it's important to have that unified vision based on a centralized platform. So we're seeing more and more that technology and data is playing an important role. And then just having the specialized teams looking at specific risk areas where, traditional compliance officer or even procurement starting from, the start wouldn't have that knowledge.
Okay. So you've kind of got unified systems, data allows you to triage and assessment. Then where you need specialist help, we can go off to the specialist team. They can then take the time they need. Obviously, everyone wants it as fast as possible, but it takes a certain amount of time. That comes back into the system, and then it goes back to a generalist to decide, okay, this is our overall picture. This is what we're going to do. Ensure sign off from the relevant parties, and then take your next action, whether that is stop the relationship, continue relationship, but with this, or actually, no, we're okay. Let's just put them in the low risk bucket because we're
Correct.
Fine. Okay, good. I would say I will try to dumb things down.
Yes.
Sorry, I said that offline.
No,
that's my job.
You understood well.
Can you just talk me through, and you kind of started to do this, but the basic tenets of what you would consider a best practice or just a good TPRM program? So I imagine we've got people that are going to be listening from all sorts of organizations, small, medium, large, international versus regional versus, domestic. I imagine they all need the basic elements, but just to different degrees. Could you maybe try and describe what you think of as the building blocks to build up your TPRM program?
I like to think about first starting with your policies and procedures. That's very important. Before that, you will have already done a pre-risk assessment. I mentioned earlier about defining your third parties, understanding what they are located, understanding what is the length of the relationship and what services they are providing to you. Then you need to definitely, create those policies and procedures. There is an element of training internally to the different parties about those policies and procedures. So different departments that needs to be involved, from procurement to your even sales representatives to, of course, the compliance team will be in most cases providing that training. The legal teams should be involved depending on the organization as well, even the credit risk departments for some organizations. Then after that training is setting up the controls. So first starting with your due diligence program, how am I going to collect information? what is the information that I already have about these suppliers or third parties, and where am I going to store all that information. So your due diligence process, it's initiated. After the due diligence process, which is one of the big pillars of that program, it's completed, then it's about making the assessment or the risk. What is the risk associated to a specific, third party, or is there a larger potential risk that can affect my network, right? So that's the supply chain risk that we were referring to earlier. And at that point, you will have to escalate accordingly to the different departments that could be looking into that in more detail. After that, it's about the ongoing monitoring. Once I already know about that supplier, about that third party, what is, as a continuation, what do I need to do to identify that throughout the relationship, the commercial relationship that we have with them, nothing changes because things could change. And last but not least is actually looking at the full program and all the pillars that I just mentioned to understand if it's working.
Okay.
Right? So is it really working, my program? Do I need to change? So it's that part of, assessment over your controls. And it goes without saying that one important piece is the mitigation, right? Even before assessing if it's working or not, because I always get this from some of our clients, and depending on, many corporations, some of them, they cannot just stop the relationship with a specific supplier which it might be in a very small jurisdiction, but they really need, a raw material or anything that they are giving them. What do you do to continue with that relationship? And well, it really depends, right, on the risk associated, but there might be some mitigation controls that you can put in place and help, increasing the transparency on that relationship.
Yeah. So I think a word that came up in a recording we did earlier today was what is reasonable, and constantly going, what's a reasonable step you can take? What's defendable? I always think it's obviously open to interpretation deliberately, but it's such an important point of how do you evidence evidence your reasoning? How is it in a control? Does it make sense? Did you follow it through, etc.? And I suppose the follow-up question I have is there's a number of pieces there, and none of them sound easy, but some sound potentially harder than others. Where have you most commonly seen organizations struggle? Which parts of TPRM cause the most headaches and sleepless nights, unfortunately, for the professionals that are trying to run them?
I think it's actually at due diligence level.
Okay.
It's really, understanding in some cases if they do need to perform due diligence on their entire, third parties. They might be sometimes, thousands and thousands. How do they then get access to that information that they need on those third parties, and how fast can they get the information? Sometimes it might not be available in the public domain. Sometimes they are liaising with a small farm in, a small place where there is no internet. What do I do about it? How do I get information? And most importantly, the other way of how they are struggling, the reason as to why it's not only about accessing information, it's also about where do I store that information? Because traditionally, some organizations, they have inherited different platforms, and there was no unified way to centralize that information. And therefore, they're still struggling in some cases to have just that one single view. So even if you compile more data, where do I store it? That is centralized, so that then it can help me, throughout other times where I need to review the specific information.
That data storage thing's so crucial. Anecdote which will horrify some people, but I think looking back, it's quite funny. It wasn't funny at the time, but I took a new sales job once upon a time, many years ago, and I was quite a young man, and I turned up and I was a backfill for somebody who was, let's say, on the other end of their career. And it turns out this gentleman had not quite understood how email inboxes worked. So every email he'd ever got, he'd printed out and put in a series of folders. So
Cute.
I turned up and was like, okay, so like, what do I need to know? Which accounts do you need to be on, et cetera, on my first days. And they went, well, here's so-and-so's folders, have fun. And it was, this is a very small team, so it was very much sink or swim. But I then spent like a week shredding documents because I just had to start from scratch. But yeah, at the time I wasn't very amused. But looking back, it was character building. Just shows use your systems because you're maybe hurting the next person in your seat.
Exactly, they're there for a reason.
Exactly. Speaking of, obviously, back in the day, business was done on paper, right? And so no knocks on that. It was a stepping stone to where we are today. But for TPRM, where are we now, and where do you think we're going? What's changing at the moment, and can you sort of play that forward? Next 2, 3, 5 years.
Yes, I think a lot of things are changing. Also because everyone is somehow forced to change due to the geopolitical situation we are in, the changes on regulations. But what I'm seeing more and more is trying to get that unified risk that I mentioned earlier. It's a common theme. Corporations, medium size, small size, and the larger sizes, they are looking at right now as to how, to have that single view, 360, some of them call it, but it's about how do I centralize my technology, my processes, so that everyone that needs to look after this particular business relationship can look into it. The way I see this in the next 5 years is I'm seeing those changes and the evolution. That evolution has to be, not slow. I would say fast and adaptable. Adaptable because there are new risks, raising every single day. It could be from thinking about, okay, fraud. Now it's also, a lot of organizations are spending a lot of time like looking into how to implement fraud within their programs, but it's not the only emerging risk, right? It's how do they then play all those within their programs, and for that they will need technology and data. And AI, how do they transform what they have today, looking forward at those next 5 years with the use of artificial intelligence. And more organizations are looking into how that can help throughout their processes, whether that could, help them with their existing SaaS platforms, whether that could help them throughout identifying more risk through data analytics of what they have, or if they are integrating or aggregating data from third parties, trying to get all that into one single hub platform.
Okay. So it sounds like the unified risk trend is kind of happening now. And I would guess if it's the thing now, that probably will become table stakes in the not too distant future. But getting the information and the right information in and the right analysis, we are doing that already, right? As an industry, as an ecosystem, but it's got to happen faster, better to meet the business demand. Is that fair?
That is, that is accurate.
And dare I say it, does that mean agents for the win, or is there a bit more nuance?
I think there has to be a combination. First, I always say, like, put your house in order. You need to understand what is the information you already have. Yeah. Everything starts from going back to basics, like the podcast, right? Look at what you have internally in your different systems. Look already at your current processes, how the different teams have been, compiling information about your third parties. Also, understand how you are going to all, interact internally. So most of the conversations in that transformation process is about how segmented those teams are right now, and how that could look potentially in the future if suddenly, risk management needs to be involved on supply risk, and then you have the treasury departments, or you have the compliance departments, you have the credit risk departments. How do they all talk to each other? And this happens with, all organizations. So it's quite interesting to see that dynamic, and then understanding what is that you can change first. And AI can help, but it's, definitely it's going to help it first. Put your house in order, and then bring the right solutions in place.
Yeah, you didn't use the phrase, but we did an episode last year on master data management, data interoperability. It sounds like if you get that right, you've got a chance. And if you don't, then you're always going to be struggling a little bit, always playing catch up and trying to correct things after the fact. So maybe if you can get your data,
absolutely,
you've got the expertise, you can bring it in, then you can get that more automation whilst having the human oversight. So Yeah, it doesn't sound like anything people don't know or aren't talking about. It's just hard to do. So it's kind of an execution thing rather than a creative thought thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's because some of those organizations have been working in silos. And then also because of the inherited technical systems, it's not always easy to then, displace one and say, I'm going to transform my entire, TPRM management program. It's about looking step by step how I can do that efficiently. And then you can, move that towards other parts of the organization. But absolutely is key, that data interoperability, what is going to help is through the efficiencies of the program, right? If they get that right, is how it's really going to help.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, we've been talking at a broad level and sort of an aggregated level so far, but I know it's always super valuable to sort of use practical examples. And I know you can't name the customers you work with on a day-to-day basis, but could you maybe provide a story or two, something where you've been working on actively with a customer that's, excited you, has sort of shown you the progress that can be made? I'd love to just hear a couple of stories.
Absolutely. So I've been quite involved in, different stages on those TPRM program transformations or third-party risk management program transformations. And what I've liked is about the view of unifying. That again, I know that I've repeated myself constantly, but what it sounds very simple is very complex, because when you are liaising at group level with organizations that they have under their umbrella different legal entities that they might be serving different businesses, is not so simple. First of all, they need the buy-in of every single individual that is, performing or within the TPRM chain, let's put that way. So by working with them, thinking about how to reunify that process, how those different departments could start talking to each other from a data perspective, and how we could bring technology and also aggregation to other data to help them take the right decisions. So it's throughout the entire transformation chain. But I think the part that, I've really enjoyed the most is, let's go back to basics. Let's see, where are your processes right now? Let's look at how you are doing every single step of, those 6 pillars that I mentioned earlier, and how we can add value and help you to streamline the entire end-to-end process. And it's been really rewarding because you get to sit down in meetings with, many senior stakeholders that are part of all those legal entities, part of the group. They all have different challenges because their businesses are all different. They all have also different challenges because they have inherited through acquisitions like multiple technology systems that might be working better than others, or they might be very comfortable doing what they do, and then change is not something that they want to see. And then you get those objections as well, right? So it's not everything easy. And it's been very rewarding, I must say.
Yeah, there's sort of technology, process and people, and it sounds like the people part is the bit you're really helping on.
Yes.
Well, I say unravel, but unravel to put back together better.
Correct.
With your projects. Well, I've got a couple of audience questions that I went and sought out from people I know that will listen to this. One was just asking around, like, for TPRM, how does the org as a whole think about the ROI when they're making investments across all these different risk types and across the unified system? Like, is there like one metric they're thinking about? Just how do they calculate what they're getting back from their investment?
We are really helping them to think about that ROI in most cases, because in some instances they might have clarity, in some others they don't. And, I recently had conversations with some clients about looking at their existing processes. How do they do it? How many people do they have in their teams? Maybe spending a lot of time on manual efforts rather than on focusing how to mitigate a specific risk area. And we've been helping them to think about how they need to compile specific information about the total volumes of all their third parties. What is the relationship that they have? What are the solutions that they are currently using that are, technology and automation versus manual effort? And then we are able to plug in a way of calculating that effort and time materials, and then assessing throughout a period of time that with the use of specific data and technology, we can help streamline those processes and then get a proper return on investment. It's not simple.
No.
Because to complete the exercise, I think the largest amount that is being spent is about compiling the initial information that we need to build that ROI.
Okay. And I suppose that is essentially measuring the total cost of operations, or the TCO, of the program, and then improving that. But the bit that I imagine is, I don't know if it's impossible, probably very hard, if not impossible, is you can't measure something that didn't happen, right? So if your TPRM did its job and you mitigated a risk and no one therefore is aware of it,
correct.
How do you know that the program gave you this huge return, arguably bigger than maybe your biggest deal that year was less than the risk that was sold through your TPRM program? You just don't know because it's not recorded anywhere, because it didn't happen, and you can't prove a negative, as they say.
Yes.
So maybe it is impossible, but I would like to plant the seed out there for any CFOs listening or CEOs listening, that maybe TPRM is adding way more value, and a little bit of investment can go a long way, even if it's hard to measure for your stakeholders.
Absolutely, Alex. And it's about thinking about the future. You need to become a little bit of a visionary. And they really need to understand, microeconomics and macroeconomics and everything, geopolitical risk and the environment we are in.
Yeah.
Because I know that, to your point, is difficult to measure what it hasn't happened. But to stay in this market and, to be efficient. And I think they really need to have that hat of what is the predictability of the future, even if there are many unknowns, so that you can take some risk decisions about your third-party risk management and, those organizations that you are making business with. So there is an element there which is more subjective, I would say, because it's more difficult to measure. But
follow-up question from me. Do you think it differs by industry, like the seriousness, or do you think, no, look, every industry needs to get this right?
Every industry needs to get this right. Then, of course, you have industries with, if it's professional services, they don't have operational risk, right? I mean, if it's a food chain company or a commodities company, then they have other risk areas to look into. So it's more about their different risk areas. But everyone, needs to understand what is the risk associated with their third parties. And based on that, they will have to put their programs in place.
Got it. And final question, this other audience question, was just which systems are most important to connect from TPRM? I assume they're sort of talking about like that automation piece. How do you integrate things? Like, are there core systems beyond, you mentioned earlier, you need the cyber and the credit and the ESG and the, the compliance, et cetera, in a unified system. But what does that system need to, to connect to make an effective program?
It needs to connect to data. And it could be starting from your CRM. Your CRM system could speak to your compliance lifecycle management system, and then through all the other departments. You need data. It's important. And then decide about what is going to be your technology. Okay. So what is going to be the base technology that you need to or you want to work with? In some organizations, they might already have some CRM platforms or procurement platforms that they start using to onboard those third parties. Those can be connected into CLM platforms that the compliance team would be using to assess other risks. But what you need is data. Without data, those systems wouldn't do much.
Yeah, what do they say? Data's the new gold or oil or something like that. But sounds like it's been proven true. So just to finish up, because there's been a really good grounding, I think, on TPRM for particularly people that might be new to the show or not familiar with the term. So thank you. Is there anywhere you would suggest they go, or anything else they read that you or your colleagues have put out, just to continue the education and continue to sort of get to grips with this quite multifaceted area as we've discussed?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Moody's, on the moodys.com website, they can find, blogs and white papers that are written by specialist IPLs, industry practice leads, or SMEs on third-party risk management and supply chain. So I would invite them to, download those documents, because there is quite a large amount of insights. We also look at what are the regulatory changes that might impact as well TPRM. And there is this study that I've been referring to. I mean, the word unified risk, it's a term that is used wisely, but we've recently also done a study interviewing corporations and financial services about third-party risk. And it's quite interesting. And that report is also part of Moody's.com, so it can be downloaded for everyone to read it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll grab the links from you. I'll put those in the show notes. If you are interested in those, go to the show notes, click the link, take a look. I don't think there's any email gating. I think you can just download it. So yeah, welcome you to that information, and I hope you find it useful. Marisol, thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Always appreciate the education. Sorry for my terrible sales methods years ago. Doing my best.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah,
it's always a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.